Welcome to my Bob Thurman podcast. I'm so grateful some good friends enabled me to present them to you. If you enjoy them and find them useful, please think of becoming a member of Tibet House US to help preserve Tibetan culture. Tibet House is the Dalai Lama's cultural center in America. All best wishes. Have a great day.
This is episode 276, an interview with Philip Goldberg.
And I'm so delighted that I'm with my dear friend, Phil Goldberg, who I only recently discovered, but he's like a long-lost dear friend, there's no doubt. And he has been studying the world's spiritual traditions for more than 45 years. You're such a youngster.
Actually,
What is this, only 45? Published in more than a dozen languages. His book, American Veda, that's the one, was named by Huffington Post and Library Journal as one of the top 10 religion books of 2010. And that means it still is in 2020. Don't give me that. It was followed in 2018 by the popular biography of Yogananda, which is a really great book, too. Yogananda was so kind and wonderful. And to America and this land of crazy asuras. And then I have this book, I like this little one called Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times, Powerful Tools to Cultivate Calm, Clarity, and Courage, which we surely need in the days of Joe Manchin posing as a Democrat. So how wonderful to see you, Phil. How are you? So I'm so pleased to speak to you since you are the expert on Hinduism. So what are you up to now, Phil? Tell me.
Doing my podcast. I'm working on a novel that is long awaited. The pandemic was ruined my last excuse for not working on the novel I've been wanting to write for 20 years. And so I've been working on that. And the theme has a lot to do with my nonfiction because my recent books have a lot to do with sort of the coming to America of the teachings we call Hinduism or the yogic legacy, and all the gurus and swamis who came here, and the infiltration.
I love his other book about spiritual practice for crazy times, but this work is truly marvelous in the way the history that it tells. About how America has finally discovered that the Pacific Ocean is on the other side and the Atlantic Ocean on this side. There's a wonderful talk given in the 1790s by a president of Yale. I don't know I forget his name, but this was brought to my attention by someone else. And saying that when America would really come into its own is when it would realize it was a bridge between Europe and Asia across the two oceans, and that it was a meeting point of them, and its Asian heritage and connection was as important or more than its European one, although many immigrants had come from Europe. And I was really impressed when the gentleman who mentioned it first to me mentioned that in an academic conference. Could it be something Stiles? Was it Joshua Stiles or somebody named Stiles? It could be. So that popped this in my mind. And maybe from somewhere else, who knows, the way the old brain gets. But something called Stiles just jumped into my head. And I can't remember the name of my colleague at Columbia who brought it up, the late so-and-so. So tell us, Phil. So Phil has written 25 books, And this one, ThreeRiversPress.com, and it is American Veda, it's called. From Emerson and the Beatles to Yoga and Meditation, How Indian Spirituality Changed the West. Forward by Houston Smith, my dear old friend Houston Smith.
Yes.
So Phil, tell us, where were you in 1960? In this, what you called it the volcano decade, in the wonderful book.
In 60, I was still in high school. And then I spent a few years in college, but during my college years, I was a pretty indifferent student and just trying to figure out how to live life. And I was very politically active, into the mid 60s with anti-war movement and civil rights, and then my entree to things spiritual came later in the 60s, 66, 67, during the counterculture years of psychedelics and exploration of trying to figure out who we were and what life was all about. And in that mix were books by people you probably knew, Alan Watts and Aldous Huxley and Joseph Campbell, and all those books about Vedanta, Alan Watts's way of Zen, Zen Flesh, Zen Bones. All these books started circulating, and Autobiography of a Yogi, which I've written about a lot, which is now celebrating its 75th anniversary. All these books started to come around, and they essentially blew my mind. And I was raised by non-religious atheists in New York, and I had no use for anything religious. But then, in the middle of all this searching, the teachings that came from the East, the Indic teachings, the Vedic teachings, and the Buddhist teachings, they just opened up new doors to me and millions of others like me, and we started to think there's something in them, something rational, something empirical, something that made sense, that wasn't superstition, and I just turned eastward and did Zen practices and so forth. And then at a certain point, after the Beatles went to India with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, which is a big watershed moment in the whole story of East meeting West.
Sure. And where were you during
at that point? I was living in Cambridge, at Boston and Cambridge. I had moved from New York, and I had started graduate school, but I in sociology, and I just couldn't hack it. It was just boring, and all I wanted to do was study Indian philosophy and learn how to meditate and all that. So I weaseled my way out of the draft and got a job and just turned in that direction, and eventually became a teacher of transcendental meditation. And the 70s began a whole new life. So, and then over the years.
So you did GM.
Yeah. That was my home, my spiritual home for several years. I trained as a teacher, and then became this sort of pragmatic mystic later, and just learning from everybody and everything, including you.
Well, that's really great. So we were probably down the street from each other in various times. It's really
probably.
Marvelous. And did you go to India at all? Did you go to India and visit there? Any of that you did?
It took me a while.
When did you first go to India?
I first was going to go to India in 1970, and that some things happened and I didn't go. and I was trained as a TM teacher in the U.S. instead of Rishikesh, and didn't get to India for a couple of decades, but I've been there 6 times since. I take tours there now and go visit gurus and swamis, and we'll do it again after the pandemic.
Oh, great. Yes, well, it's amazing
Yes.
place, isn't it? It has every extreme of India does. It has every extreme of difficulty, and then it has beauty, and
Yeah. And when you take a tour group, as you know, you have to be very careful about all that. And for the first time in our next tour, next fall in October, Dharamsala will be part of the trip. I've never been.
that's really great. And who did you go with? Shantam Seth, or what travel? Who do you travel with? Do you arrange it yourself, or do you have a?
I co-lead the tour, and it's called American Veda Tours. Essentially, we're following the theme of my book and taking people to places associated with the gurus they're familiar with who came to the West and had an impact on everybody's lives. But and we have a tour person in India who takes care of things.
I love your treatment also of Emerson and Thoreau and Whitman. And
Yes.
how do you connect the 3 of them? Can you tell us a little about that? Well, that's way, of course, a century before all of us, right? 100 years before us all.
I see them and the Transcendentalists as a whole. They're sort of the founding fathers of that American spirit of independent seeking and searching and direct experience of the divine. And Emerson was among the very first people to be deeply influenced by the teachings that came here from the East. Of course, there were no lamas or gurus at the time. There were no yoga studios or meditation centers, but they had the books. They were starting to get reasonable translations and commentaries. Emerson was deeply influenced by the early work about the life of the Buddha, the light, what was it called, the light of the East or something, and Vedic texts,
Light of Asia,
Gita, or first translations of the Gita and other books, and they were deeply influenced by it. Thoreau called himself a yogi in Walden. And I remember reading that in college and saying, what does that mean? And he wrote about reading the Bhagavad Gita. And I remember going to look for one and not being able to find a copy in New York until I was told about Weiser's bookstore, which you're probably remember.
Weiser bookstore, right. Sure. And that's all the beatniks used to go there too. Weiser's.
That's right.
They still exist. They still exist.
So people, Whitman and Emerson in particular, and of course a lot of Whitman's poetry, they evoke India. They evoke Hindu and Buddhist precepts and teachings, sometimes explicitly, sometimes you have to read between the lines to see the influence that these teachings had, the books had on them. But that is the beginning of a transmission from India through prominent Americans into the mainstream culture. Everybody reads Emerson, everybody reads Thoreau, but we don't always know we're being influenced by Indian philosophy when we do. And that was the beginning. And then by the end of the 19th century, and they had a big impact on the New Thought movement, Madame Blavatsky and all those people. And then the gurus started coming. First, Swami Vivekananda in 1893. And then Yogananda in 1920. And then the explosion of the gurus and the Zen masters in the post-war world that you remember very well.
It's amazing. Well, didn't you say here? You said that of the 3 types of yoga in the Bhagavad Gita, you have karma yoga, jnana yoga. You have action yoga, wisdom yoga, and devotion yoga, and you assigned the 3
Yeah,
the three American stalwarts to each. Which was which? Which was which now?
To me, Emerson is the Jnani, the man of discernment
so he was the
intellect.
Guy.
Yes, and Thoreau was more of a karma yogi, especially in his civil disobedience and action-oriented way. And Whitman was the American bhakta. Whitman was a bhakta, right? Whitman was
the devotee. That's wonderful.
Yeah, he was celebrating the divine in everyday life and everyday experience, and so I gave them those labels.
That's totally ingenious. But did you ever expect? I know you didn't mention it in the book, but did you ever suspect that any of them might be the rebirth or reincarnation of some Indian yogis or siddhas or scholars or pandits or something? Did you ever feel that way?
Why not? I mean, that's way above my pay grade to even speculate about such things. But you wonder sometimes, why was I, this kid who grew up in Brooklyn with atheist parents, why did I resonate so much when I first read the Gita, when I first read The Way of Zen? Why did I resonate with all this? And you can't help but think, I must have had previous lives in Zen monasteries or something. But
how come they went to Harvard, right?
Yeah, and Emerson was
I think so myself. I had some kids. Right, I had some kids in a class of mine at Amherst who played a trick on me. And they said, "Oh, Professor, I used to teach a course called Poetry of Enlightenment, in which I read different Indian siddhas and Zen koans and Zen, haiku and things like that, and also classical Indian Sanskrit poetry." And then they brought in some passages of Whitman, and I hadn't read that for years at that point.
Yeah.
And they said, "There's this. We read this thing somewhere," and they pretended they didn't know who wrote it. And they said, "We don't know the name of which Indian siddha this was." And it was just quoted by somebody, and they read about 5-6 lines of Leaves of Grass, and I didn't recognize it right away. And they said, "Which siddha is this? Is this Saraha, or do you know this one?" And something. And I was scratching my head, and I didn't say, "Oh, that's not a siddha, that's Whitman." And I was really thinking they had found something. I said, "Where did you find that quoted?" And all this. And then they were, "Ha. It's Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass."
That's great.
Right,
That's brilliant. Brilliant.
It was just like one of the great Indian siddhas,
Yes.
Buddhist
Yes,
siddhas. And so I nowadays, especially, I see them as doing that. And, India has such an amazing relationship with America.
Yes.
Because we were the first to break out of the British Empire.
Right.
Right? And did you know that Tipu Sultan, did you ever know this? That Tipu Sultan, remember who he was?
No.
Did you ever hear of him?
No.
Tipu Sultan was the Gaddafi of the 19th century. He was the British Empire's Gaddafi figure in India. He was the Maharaja of Mysore.
Oh,
okay. And he was a Francophile. And he didn't like England, conquering. It was before the Indian Mutiny in the early part of the 19th century, I think. And he sent 3 chests of jewels to the American revolutionaries.
Wow.
In the late 18th, I guess they're not 19th, but late 18th, with different European ship captains who robbed each one. So none of them ever arrived.
Wow.
None of them ever reached Washington and Valley Forge or something, a big chest of Indian jewels.
He was trying to help fund the revolution?
Yeah, he liked that we were throwing off the empire,
Wow.
Yeah, he was, because he didn't want the British East India Company taking over India. They hadn't solidified their hold totally yet.
Yeah.
And so then he was vilified by the British, killed by them eventually, and they really didn't like him. But then he was fond of the French, right? Like Lafayette.
Wow.
We know about Lafayette, but we don't know about Tipu Sultan, was his name. He was a very colorful figure. I don't know that much about him, but I was amazed by that.
Amazing.
Yeah, and the second thing we owe to the Indians is that apparently some politician in the London Parliament, when Cornwallis had gone up into Canada and was asking for reinforcements to get back after Washington. And we were at a low point, right? Washington was in Valley Forge or something. Around that time, there was a vote in the British Parliament where the people, I guess the lobbyists of the East India Company, said to the assembled lords, well, sir, we can either reinforce Cornwallis in Canada, or we can, solidify our hold in India. One or another. We can't do both. So, which do you prefer? Furs and lumber and tobacco, or jewels and silks and curry? And they said, oh, by God, we'll have the curry. We'll have the jewels. So then they decided to let America go as far as investing more heavily militarily in America to suppress the colonists,
Wow.
Isn't that amazing? I only learned that, not that, I didn't know that, of course, from school, but I learned it someday. Isn't it amazing? So, it's the right.
It is. I never knew that.
Isn't that something? That's really great. So you did Zen too. You say, did you meditate at any particular Zen center, Cambridge Zen Center or something? What did you do?
No, I in those days I was just I was picking it up from books. I was reading books on Zen and thinking, oh, you're supposed to meditate. There's this thing called Zazen. Okay, I'll read the instructions in the book and do it. And I was just giving myself a headache. And so when TM came along, it was a lot easier and there was actual instruction. And I thought, okay, well, let's try this. And it resonated deeply with me and was very transformative in my life. And so I decided to drop out of graduate school and become a teacher of it.
We're teaching through these many, many books. And do you teach it? Do you know that Menla Hall place in Los Angeles? Do you know that philosophy place? What's it called?
Yeah, philosophical research.
Yes. Have you ever taught there?
I gave a talk. I gave a talk there once when it's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, they have a nice lecture hall.
I gave a talk there once when American Veda came out.
I know, and I met not the present head, but the previous one, who I'm afraid passed away. And he wanted me to come and really develop a curriculum and all that. But I couldn't because I'm so busy here in the East, But I gave a talk a couple of times. And I think it would be a wonderful center for the type of teaching that you'd give. They should give the place to you, actually.
No, thanks. No, thanks.
Teach there, but maybe you don't feel like
I'd be happy to show up, but I don't want to. Don't give me any administrative tasks, please.
And then you have this East Wind section about all this Huxley. Esalen, yes, you have a wonderful thing. Tell us about Esalen. Did you? How do you fit Esalen into the picture? And Mike Murphy.
Oh, Esalen and what was called Michael and all the sort of corridor between Esalen and Big Sur and events in San Francisco around the same time, what came to be called the San Francisco Renaissance. That was enormous in this transmission of East and West. Michael Murphy started Esalen in 1962 as a essentially consciously as a meeting ground of traditional Eastern teachings and modern Western thinking. He had been strongly influenced. Did you ever know Frederick Spiegelberg, the scholar?
No, I didn't, but I know many people who were very strongly, Stanford professor, yes, very strongly influenced by him, and who have been friends of mine, and he really had a big impact.
He had a big impact on Michael Murphy, and Michael went to India and studied with Sri Aurobindo at the Sri Aurobindo ashram for a while, and then came back and eventually started Esalen. And at the same time, there were things going on in San Francisco with people like Alan Watts and Spiegelberg giving lectures on the various forms of Asian philosophy and teaching. But Esalen started doing workshops with people like your friend Houston and Aldous Huxley and Abraham Maslow and Joseph Campbell and Alan Watts and all these people. And it was a tremendous catalyst for this integration, for transformation of Western psychology, for one thing, into humanistic and transpersonal psychology, and the integration of Eastern spiritual teachings into the West.
Right, it sure was. Well, do you think, is it still functioning like that? It kind of is, isn't it? Or then there's CIIS, the California Institute of Integral Studies, with the sort of Aurobindo name, but they don't seem to relate to each other much, do they? Or do they? Can you explain more about that?
I'm sure there's still connections between Esalen and CIIS, but CIIS started as an offshoot of this, what was it called? The American Association of Asian Studies, with Spiegelberg and Alan Watts and people like that. And then they started California Institute of Integral Studies, and it was very strongly East-West psychology oriented. They still have that East-West psychology program, but I don't know the extent to which that Sri Aurobindo Eastern teachings orientation is still at the center of what they do. It's still certainly a part of it, and a leading place for transpersonal psychology. Yeah, and it's a lot of what they were doing uniquely, and the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology also has been more integrated into the mainstream. You see a lot of the kind of programs they do in other universities and institutions, but they're still functioning, and they're still training people in integrating spiritual methodologies and spiritual orientations into the practice of psychotherapy and other disciplines. So it's still a vital place. And in fact, I know the person who's running the East-West program now is very a scholar of Sri Aurobindo, so and of Indian descent, of Bengali descent. So,
that's good.
Yeah.
So that's still happening. Yes, I taught there in the 80s, and for one semester, I had a sabbatical semester, and I taught there, and I flirted with the idea of leaving Amherst and moving there, because every New Yorker thinks they might move to California. You actually did.
I did, yeah.
But I haven't been able to extricate myself from Manhattan somehow, like Walt Whitman, the Mannahatta. I'm a Mannahatta native, and I love California, but I've never been able to go there and stay, other than short periods. But that's interesting. I'm wondering, do you think there has been some kind of reaction to all of this? In other words, and also, what about the relationship between Hinduism and Buddhism?
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
In the first, well, you're the scholar of that, but in the first part of the book, I have to explain why I covered only what we think of as Hinduism, which is really mainly Vedanta and yoga that came here and found its way into the fabric of the culture. And I acknowledge in there that there's a parallel history of Buddhism coming to America, but I knew less about that, and it would have doubled my research and doubled the size of the book. Plus, people like Rick Field had already done histories of Buddhism in America, so I didn't feel I needed to cover that.
Right.
But there was always this interplay. So you had the Suzukis, running the Zen Center in New York and in San Francisco, each of the Suzukis having a big influence, an influence on the beat poets, and the Zen became very popular. And the same people who were influenced by that would also have been influenced by yoga and by Vedanta philosophy and reading books like, so I think most seekers in America who lean to the East, we're very pragmatic, and we'll draw from Buddhism, we'll draw from Hinduism, we'll draw from yoga and Vedanta, we'll draw from Theravada and Mahayana and whatever works. whatever gives us some insight, whatever seems
Right, right.
practical. Don't you agree? Haven't you seen that?
I do, and I think it's interesting that like like D.T. Suzuki was very sort of perennialist in his fondness of various Hindu-oriented Western teachers and Indians that he knew, and they loved Tagore and these kind of people. In other words, it was interesting that in America they would meet there, and they would not be caught in the because in India itself, of course, they had sort of lost Buddhism, and they think of Buddhism as kind of Sri Lanka, nowadays. They think that's a thing from Sri Lanka. And the Mahayana Buddhism they associate with China and Tibet. In those days, they didn't. Tibet was not really on the horizon, but China and Japan and Zen, But they were very friendly mutually, and they knew a lot about each other in the American setting. So they sort of had a new union in a way, which may have been something more like how Buddhism was before the Muslims came to India at the beginning of the second millennium, where there was a lot of interaction between them. There were debates, but there was borrowing back and forth, and there was very strong interconnectedness for almost 1,500 years. And then that got lost for 800 years.
I know a lot of Indians, as you know, a lot of Hindus consider Buddha an incarnation, one of the avatars, and they'll venerate him, and they love having the Dalai Lama in their country. They love people going to Sarnath and Bodh Gaya, and they don't make those. Every guru I've ever seen or spoken to or heard lecture, every Swami, they'll quote Buddha just as readily as they quote Shankara, or they'll quote they understand, especially the non-dualists. They understand that these are eternal teachings.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Certainly, a figure like Ramakrishna.
Yes.
Yeah,
that's wonderful. Well, Ramakrishna, though, he did Islam, Hinduism, and Christianity as a personal practice, right? All those three to show their thing. But he did not do Buddhism.
Not that I know of. It just wasn't there.
It wasn't available to him. But he did the Hindu view of Buddha. Hindu view of Buddha, and as you say, as if Buddha was a part of Hinduism, which is very good. I'm very interested in this nowadays myself, because the Dalai Lama has been emphasizing what he calls his fourth aim in life. He has a famous three aims that he always has been emphasizing as a human, as a Buddhist monk, and as a Tibetan. But his fourth aim is as a son of India and a son of Nalanda, he calls it, the great Buddhist university that was there for 1,000 years in Bihar, and which is to bring the Buddhist aspect of Indian science, psychology, contemplative science, and so on, back to India, not as Buddhism, but just as Indian science. So to rekindle the Sanskrit interaction, because Pali is a little different from Sanskrit, and there are no Hindu works in Pali, but the Sanskrit Buddhist works and the Hindu works are there. But unfortunately, most of the Sanskrit Buddhist works were lost and only translated in Tibetan, and so they have to be reconstructed from Tibetan, and that has been very much my work, also. I've been trying to do his fourth aim, So that's why I look to you as an authority.
No, I think it's great that he's doing that. It's wonderful that of somebody of his stature. I mean, he's the best known Buddhist in the world, and if he does that, I'm sure it'll be a very welcome development in India.
Yeah, in the Tibetan collection, they have two collections. They have the Buddhist scripture collection of translations from India, from Sanskrit, of the Mahayana Sutras, right, and some Theravada things they also have. And then they have these shastras, these sort of treatises, like Shankaracharya, the kind of works that we're debating with the Nyayas, with the Mimamsa, with the Vedantas. They have those texts. And those are the ones that he's particularly excited about. He wants those because they are they're not denominational. They're more like scientific treatises. And he wants them to be accessible to Indian intellectuals. And he wants Indians to feel more proud of their own science as a complement, but different from Western science, in the sense that in the Indian science, the inner science, psychology is the king, not physics. Do you know what I mean? In the West, maybe physics is the king science because you can blow up the world with it, and you can make cannons, and make explosives and things with chemistry. But in India, the psychological science was mind science was by far the most important.
That's very compatible with some of the aims of many of the gurus I'm familiar with. Vivekananda spoke about that kind of thing as well. The sort of meeting of the subjective sciences of India with the objective sciences of the West. Vivekananda used to have discussions with Tesla about things like that. And Yogananda spoke about those things. When I was spending time with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in the 70s, he would have conferences with people like Bucky Fuller and other eminent physicists and chemists, and they would talk about this integration of Eastern and Western science. So it's wonderful what the Dalai Lama is trying to do. It was fascinating. I went to a number of those. Yeah, in the 70s, they were not only, they were transcribed, but they were also video recorded. There were always cameras going. And in fact, I think you can find, if you Google talks with Maharishi and Bucky Fuller. I seem to remember a Nobel Prize-winning physicist named Brian Josephson, and others being there, biologists, high-level biologists, and they would talk about their disciplines.
Oh, good.
And how the subjective science of consciousness related to those and could amplify their findings and so forth. It was fascinating, even to someone like me just sitting in the audience.
Oh, that's great, yes.
But if you look at Tesla would talk about Indian concepts that he learned from Vivekananda in some of his writings.
Okay.
Even going back, to the late 19th century.
Yes. Well,
maybe you're going to be a catalyst for this East and West.
Well, maybe, but I hope so. We do have, the Dalai Lama has had 20, 30 years of talking with scientists too. And but mostly it's been a kind of one way where the science is more talking to him, and they don't really ask that much about Buddhist science. In fact, even some of them think there is no such thing. And I'm sure if they had talked to me, they would think that, well, they call it science.
Really?
Yeah. There's a tendency because scientific materialism has been, post William James has become so strongly entrenched, that the idea of anybody who thinks that there might be such a thing as the mind or the spirit being a scientist is very hard for them. Professional scientists nowadays. It's kind of it's not easy for them. It's kind of against the card, the card carrying standards of the guild. Do you know what I mean? And usually they're only old or retired nobelists or somebody. The ones who are actively seeking tenure or active in some Caltech or somewhere, MIT, they're very reluctant to align themselves or associate themselves with the spiritual science, so to speak. In fact, they don't get that expression. Maybe not a capable expression, actually. Oxymoron, what they call it.
But many of them are doing research on meditative practices and being guided by the Dalai Lama and other people. So some of them are obviously open to at least.
Well, yes, but they're doing research in the sense of they are putting electrodes and putting people in MRIs to see what is materially and physically happening in the brain when they meditate, but they don't do research in the texts, in the books, in the disciplines, in the curriculum that they studied to be able to do the things that they do. That they don't ask questions about, you know. And I know because that's my field, is trying to develop more resources, and they don't ask about it. They don't prioritize it. More hardware, not so much software. More hardware, mainly.
Yeah.
So okay, so great. So listen, Phil. So what are you doing now? What is your next book? What is your next book now, Phil? What are you passionate about now?
Well, Bob, I'm passionate about the novel I started working on a long time ago. And as I said at the beginning of our chat, the pandemic was blew my last excuse. So I've been working to make progress on this novel, which is in a sense, the main character in the novel is living what I described earlier about integrating the teachings of the East into his life in New York City in the 60s. But I'm also working on some nonfiction books that I won't talk about at the moment. And because I'm superstitious, we'll see if they materialize. But also, and I have my podcast on which you've been a guest twice.
Yes.
And
thank you. Yes.
At the moment, I'm involved in a lot of. I'm going to be doing a course for Hindu University of America on the Autobiography of a Yogi. It's
wonderful.
Yogananda's his iconic memoir. It's the 75th anniversary of that book's publication. So I'm doing a lot of talks and stuff about it. Because, I wrote a biography of Yogananda. And so I'm doing a course starting in January. We'll go deeply into the book, and I'll bring in stuff that's not in the book.
Did you know that Steve Jobs at his memorial service had all the people who attended? Unfortunately, I was not invited, or I would have happily gone.
Yes.
But he gave a copy of the Autobiography of a Yogi to everyone. He asked his family to give that to all the people who attended.
Yes.
So that was a deep influence on Steve Jobs. It's marvelous.
Yes, I do. And yes, it was. Yes. And George Harrison used to keep copies around to give to people, too.
Oh, that's really great. It's a beautiful book. It does teach about the miraculous things. There are things in there that are indeed miraculous.
Yes.
That are very, very, very marvelous,
Miracles and wonders.
Yes. Well, I do hope, I just put in a plea. I love about the novel. Who are the bad guys in the novel? There must be bad guys in the novel, right? Or you don't have to say if you don't want to, but
no, it's
the Blue Meanies.
No, nothing of an action oriented villains to sort of plot. It's more of an internal quest and overcoming inner obstacles.
I see.
And there's a little baseball in it.
Well, then let me ask you this: what about the planet? Do you think we'll make it?
Oh God, Bob!
You live in California. You're an optimist with all the fire and the drought. What do you think personally? Will we make it?
I worry.
Do you think?
I worry.
Will Emerson and Thoreau and Whitman have been prophets in vain? Will they have taught in vain? The rediscovery of nature, becoming the eye, all-seeing eye in nature, etc. Will we make it? What do you think personally?
I have to say, one of the things I admire about you is that you're a deeply spiritual man and a leader in bringing spirituality and spiritual ideas out to the world, but you're very much in the world and very active and very oriented toward the real issues that we all face. By the way, it's one of the things I came to admire about Yogananda, because he was a monk, but he would speak out against things that were going on in his time. And I think you talked about America and India. We have the influence of Thoreau on Gandhi, and then Gandhi's influence on Martin Luther King. And these were all deeply spiritual people who are also activists, and it requires that of us now. It requires all of the Dalai Lama's compassion and all of Gandhi's fire and energy, and Martin Luther King's righteous indignation, and it requires all of us to get up off of our cushions afterward and do something, because it's urgent.
That's true.
I mean, we're in the mid. I'm living in LA,
Yes.
and we love the sunshine and the warm weather in the winter when you guys in back east are freezing. But every day is a beautiful day. But we don't have any water. The drought is very serious, and the hills are burning, from time to time, and now the Pacific Northwest. Now there are huge floods. A few months ago was fires and excessive heat. So we need to do something quick, and the resistance to it just is so irritating. I can't, avidya. It's ignorance to willful ignorance.
It really is. It really is. Well. So, but you're not sure. In other words, we'll make it. I feel sure.
I don't know.
Sort of intellectually, I feel sure. I feel very sure. Of course, nobody knows, but I feel very sure intellectually that we will. But emotionally, I keep fearing that we'll do some really stupid things, more stupid things. I really will.
Yeah, and I'm confident we will, but I'm it's agonizing to think of the suffering and destruction that's going to happen along the way.
It is. It really is. Well, you know what? People who read your books are not going to engage in the destruction. That's one thing. They're going to do something suitable, practice, and they're going to act in the right way. So thank you for that. And it's good not to be sure, I guess, because then people don't take it for granted.
Thank you, Bob.
And I sort of follow the idea that we should visualize success. And I love Paul Hawken's writing for that. I admire his regeneration book. I don't know if you know it, but if you don't, you'd really enjoy it, I think. And he's saying,
I know his
this
work.
latest book is called Regeneration, and he's just very positive. He's saying, listen, millions of people are doing millions of little things, and they don't get on CNN, and you don't know what's happening, but it's all adding up, and we're getting there, and we will get there in this generation. He's saying, and he projects a very strong data-driven confidence, which I find very, very salutary. I really appreciate it. So let's join in prayer for that and dedicate this to that. Absolutely.
May all beings be in
Absolutely.
peace.
And thank you so much for your Vedaization of America. And may I put in a plug for in any nonfiction books that you look at the interconnection. Did you ever read Lal Manish Joshi's book? Lal Manish Joshi, he died prematurely. Indian. He was Indian. He was the chairman of the department at the Guru Gobind Singh Department of the Punjabi University, Patiala, of world religions, the only world religion department in India, sort of founded with the influence of Wilfred Cantwell Smith and people like that, Houston Smith, Wilfred Cantwell Smith. And he was the chair of that, and then he was moving to Benares, and then he died tragically in a kind of accident. But he wrote a book called Studies in the Ancient Buddhistic Culture of India that is really marvelous about the ancient relation between Buddhism and Hinduism. That is, I think, really quite wonderful. And it might stimulate you to use your immense knowledge of all the great Vedantins and all the great international Indian teaching figures to see to see in a different light some of their connections to Buddhism, to Indian Buddhism. So you might. So So I would
I'd
urge
like
that if
that.
you go in that direction in your nonfiction, okay? Okay, lots of love. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Okay.
And folks, you can catch
Bye.
Phil at the Hindu University of America in January, and a wonderful course about his wonderful book. You should read the book ahead of time if you can. His biography of Yogananda, his study of the what man who wrote Autobiography for Yogi, the very seminal figure here on us here in America, who came a century ago, but wonderful person. So thank you, Phil, and all the best.
The Bob Thurman podcast is brought to you in part through the generous support of the Tibet House US Menla membership community and listeners like you, and is distributed through a Creative Commons No Derivatives license. Please feel free to share, like, and post on your favorite social media platform. Tashi Delek, and thanks for tuning in.